Almost immediately, what I observed were protests and agitation against Israel, against the victim. And that, of course, just made no sense to me, just on the basis of simple decency. And so I spoke to political people I know, and I have lots of friends on the right and on the left in Canada, the United States, and Europe, and the Middle East. And I said, this looks like a campaign. This looks quite organized and quite well done. And the response I got from everybody was absolutely. This is a global propaganda campaign against Jews, the Jewish state, but also Western democracy. And it hasn't relented ever since.
Today is Wednesday, August 26th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. After October 7th, many people assumed that the explosion of anti-Israel activity around the world was a spontaneous grassroots movement. But what if one of the most consequential campaigns of our time wasn't fought with soldiers or diplomats, but with influencers, protest movements, and social media? My guest today is Warren Kinsella. He's one of Canada's best-known political strategists, and for decades, he's designed political campaigns and studied how public opinion is shaped. In his new book called The Hidden Hand, The Information War, and the Rise of Antisemitic Propaganda, he argues that much of what we've witnessed these past 2.5 years was a sophisticated information campaign designed to shape how people understand Israel, Jews, and the conflict. Today, we're going to go beyond the headlines to examine how narratives are weaponized. Let's get into it. Warren Kinsella, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Thanks so much for having me.
I have a fellow Canadian with me. This is nice. And I have a nice non-Jewish journalist, political strategist. So how does a guy with excellent career credentials come to get caught up in this whole anti-Semitism mess?
I think it was how my parents raised me and my brothers. And my dad was a doc, and I was born in Montreal. I was born in a very Jewish neighborhood. We had Jewish friends and Jewish colleagues, and it's just our life. And we moved around a lot, Texas and Ontario and Quebec and so on. But it was in Alberta I encountered for the first time organized racism. I talk about it in The Hidden Hand. Some skinheads, Nazi skinheads, came to one of the shows that I put on, and we're making Nazi salutes. And, we all have moments in our lives when there's just some crystallizing thing. And that was the crystallizing moment for me where anti-Semitism had moved, which I didn't ever doubt existed. I just hadn't experienced it. It moved from the theoretical or the academic to the real. It became a preoccupation of mine and has ever since, because regrettably, the problem has just gotten worse.
And congratulations on your new book, The Hidden Hand. I have it right here. In the book, you argue that what many people see as a spontaneous grassroots movement in response to October 7th was, at least in part, a sophisticated political campaign. Now, you've spent your career designing political campaigns. So how is it that you knew it wasn't organic?
When you work in a political campaign, and all of us have won some and we've all lost some.
But you have won more than most.
I've won a few. And the one skill you acquire is how to spot them. And, what are the emblems? What are the indicators of a campaign? A campaign manager and campaign co-chairs and communications people for mainstream media and for social media and fundraisers and volunteers in the front, the people who do outreach. And what I noticed after the 7th, so the 7th, as we all know, but it's important to remind people, was the greatest act violence against the Jewish people on a single day since the Holocaust. 1,200 men, women killed, children, babies killed, Israeli women and girls sexually violated, 250 kidnapped, and hundreds who are often forgotten, grievously wounded. So this terrible day when Israel was so obviously the victim of Hamas and this evil. And almost immediately, what I observed were protests and agitation against Israel, against the victim. And that, of course, just made no sense to me, just on the basis of simple decency. And so I spoke to political people I know, and I have lots of friends on the right and on the left in Canada, the United States, and Europe, and the Middle East. And I said, this looks like a campaign. This looks quite organized and quite well done. And the response I got from everybody was absolutely. This is a global propaganda campaign against Jews, the Jewish state, but also Western democracy. And it hasn't relented ever since.
You spoke about simple decency. And I think what so many people in the Jewish community have found so unnerving is that we've just watched these claims about Jews or Israel that are truly preposterous and would have once been dismissed as just insane, have become mainstream news. So you have the New York Times running a story about Israeli rape dogs. You have Mamdani out there pretending he can arrest world leaders if they're Israeli world leaders. You have members of Congress railing against Jewish money. You have the vice president of the United States going on Joe Rogan to just drop the notion that Jeffrey Epstein was an Israeli American spy. Why is it that just the normal standards of critical thinking have collapsed when the topic is either Israel or Jews?
The indicators of anti-Semitism, as we both know, have always existed. You've always had Holocaust deniers and Hitler freaks and neo-Nazis. They were always there, but they always clustered at the margins of the popular discourse about debates, about elections. One of these assholes would run for public office and they'd come, 15th out of a field of 15. And what they discovered around the mid 90s, David Irving and Ernst Zundel and Forisson in France and all these other, mainly Holocaust deniers, was the power of the internet. And what it enabled them to do is to communicate their homily of hate globally, instantaneously, with zero cost. That had never happened to them before. And what's extraordinary, and I talk about this in the book, because I've written about the far right, the neo-Nazi white supremacist far right. They learned from their predecessors, the Zundels and so on, how to propagate their message around the world. And what they were aided and abetted by was, of course, getting back to my description of a campaign structure. The campaign manager here is Iran, the enemy of Israel and the Jewish people. The co-chairs here are Russia and China, I would say. The banker is Qatar. And then here in the West, you've got this alphabet soup of NGOs and charities and nonprofits who are anti-Semitic in nature, who've all come together to create this global propaganda campaign. And it has been exceedingly effective in a way that the Holocaust deniers of old could only dream of. There's a couple of reasons why I think they've been very successful. And part of it is they've targeted very carefully one specific audience.
Say more.
The audience is young people. What they have successfully done is persuaded young people. And you and I have known each other for a while. I'm a big guy. So when I see these protests, I just wade right into the middle of them. And I'll go up to a kid and say, that sign you're holding, that's anti-Semitic. Like, that's a horrible, terrible thing that you're saying. And these kids will say to you, because they are mainly kids, Gen Z from about 18 to 24, millennials from about 25 to 42. They'll say, well, no, I'm not being anti-Semitic. I'm being anti-racist. That has been the central success of this global propaganda campaign that I write about in the book, which is they have successfully propagated the notion to these young people that Israel is a fascistic, white supremacist, colonialist, apartheid state in the way that South Africa once was. And so what they've done is say, well, if you join us in this effort, you're being an anti-racist, you're not being anti-Semitic. And that has been the characteristic of this campaign from the outset. And they've been assisted by, an unlimited supply of funds from places like Qatar and some serious organizational chops that, some of us in the West, we kind of arrogantly assume, well, it's Hamas. They couldn't organize their way out of a paper bag. Militarily, that is so. Israel will always prevail, thank God, in battles with Hamas and Hezbollah. But on the propaganda front, my friend, Israel is getting its ass kicked because Israel has kind of let go the job of telling its own story. And into that void, because communications abhors a void, have stepped these haters, and they very successfully captured that one demographic.
You are pretty tough on Israel and PR. That I am going to ask you about it, but every propaganda campaign needs an audience that's willing to receive the message. Why is it that you think that these narratives have found such fertile ground in Western democracies?
With young people in particular, it's been very successful going back because of the pandemic. The ADL, for example, for about 60 years did comprehensive polling that's available publicly, people who can check it out, that found that always people on the right, the left, young, old, east, west, whatever, if you were concerned about anti-Semitism, you were also concerned about racism, right? They kind of moved in tandem. And around the time of the pandemic, for young people, their preoccupation with racism continued, but their concern about anti-Semitism wasn't like that. And so the pandemic was a time when it was terrible for young people. They were told their dreams about the future and home ownership and jobs and so on were largely gone. They, commencement exercises and proms, all of that stuff was gone. It was a crummy time for young people. And what guys like me do in campaigns, we look for what we call drivers. What is driving public opinion? And the driver of public opinion in that time, about 5 or 6 years ago, was the internet became a source of conspiracy theories about Jews and the Jewish state. And so what you saw, and it's in the data, where young people started to believe in conspiracy theories at that time. Their world in its entirety was the internet. And so COVID was invented by Jews. And it was invented by Jews so that they could profit because they own all the pharmaceutical companies and all of this nonsense, all of this bullshit. But it was very effectively done in a way that, the predecessors like Zundel and so on had not. And so that's why you started to see this divergence with young people to the point where we have now, when the seventh happened, the bad guys were ready to go. It wasn't like something magically happened on the morning of the seventh, this terrible day in the history of humanity, I would argue. It was something that had been building for quite some time. And like any smart campaign, the people leading this campaign weren't after 100%, because most people my age, for example, still support Israel and Israel's right to exist within safe and secure borders and to defend itself. It's young people where the problem exists, and that's where they targeted their campaign.
But it's no longer just young people. You and I are both in Toronto at the moment. The mayor of Toronto has been horrific in failing to address anti Semitism in the city. It's running rampant. You have people shooting at schools, you have people attacking synagogues, you have protesters marching through Jewish neighborhoods. But then you also see it in members of Congress in the United States. You see it in the mayor of New York City. You see it in world leaders in Australia, in France, in Britain, and the list goes on and on. So this is not just a young people problem anymore. What is it that is going on in the West that makes anti Semitism so easily adopted and absorbed?
I speak in synagogues and community centers. I speak at Jewish organizations all the time. And I'm going to be doing a lot more of that in support of the book in the coming weeks. And, I'll have people say to me, well, Warren, in Canada, there's this number of Jews and there's 4 times as many Muslims. And I'll say, yeah. And they believe that I think that's what's driving this political change that you described. But it's not just there. It's in public opinion. So 75% of registered New Democrats in the United States now count themselves as opposed to Israel. And, for about a month now, the latest data is about 55% of Republicans also express the same horrible point of view. So what the politicians are doing is what politicians have done since time immemorial. They're looking at the polls, they're looking at the numbers and seeing that public opinion is orbiting away, it's gravitating away against Israel. And they're saying, well, the hell with it. I'm going to kind of go with the crowd if I want to get reelected. And that's why I say, and I think you want to talk to me about it, why I think Israel needs to step up its game in telling its story, because it's not just the bad guys who've led us to this moment. Israel needs to do a better job of telling its own story.
100%. Let's talk about that. You and many, many, many other people argue that Israel has been terrible at the information war. But there are people that are going to say, look, the situation being what it is, no matter what Israel says or does, there's just people that are going to condemn it anyways. The United Nations has been anti Israel for long before October 7th. You have these human rights organizations that have been condemning Israel for decades. You have countries that have been making horrific statements about the Jewish state forever. So why even try to satisfy international opinion?
I mean, it goes back to 1948 and partition. Like it's been unrelenting, but it is particularly bad now. And it's extraordinary that it's really bad right now at a time when Jews, so obviously around the world, like, this summer we've learned from Statistics Canada, 75% of hate crimes in Canada, in this country you and I are in right now, are against Jews. 75%,
And what percentage of Canadians are Jewish?
less than 2%.
Right.
So, it's way out of proportion to their membership in this country, their citizenship. So, I mean, I love Israel and I love Israelis. And, one day when I croak, you're going to be one of the people tossing my ashes or somewhere in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv.
Noted.
Yeah. Well, you can do that if you want.
I have to think about that. Okay, cool.
And,
Good to know.
but, I love Israel and I love Israelis. And, when you go there, we've both been there so many times, you see black kids in the IDF. And you see Muslims in the judiciary and in the Knesset, and you see women in positions of authority that does not happen elsewhere in democracy. You see that Israel is a diverse, pluralistic, truly democratic state. And it's an amazing story that the world needs to see, because the moment the world sees and understands the reality of Israel, that is when I believe public opinion, those drivers I refer to, that those are going to shift. That is going to change because it's not a white supremacist state. The first thing I did when I was in Israel last month is I took a picture of a traffic sign saying, Jerusalem that way and Tel Aviv that way. And the second language is Arabic.
Right.
But, Israel, in fairness, I'm not being critical per se of Israel's inability to tell that story at the present time, because Israel's been fighting a war largely alone, actually now alone, on 7 fronts. So they're kind of busy. But I think that when we have some relative degree of calm, Jews need to do what Jews do better than anybody else does, which is tell the story about this amazing democracy. And I think that will help suppress some of the awful stuff that we're seeing across Western democracy.
Israel does have a good story to tell. And I always feel like people getting to see the reality, and Israel's not perfect and it's got its flaws, but even so, the overall product is something that we can stand proudly behind. So I agree with you in that sense. But the question is how? How do we compete with social media content that's emotional, simple, super viral, intended to elicit emotions in order to get clickbait, rage bait, and generate profits for the platforms? That's what we're up against. How do we do that and tell our story?
Yeah, and you know more about that subject than just about anybody I know, and it is exceedingly difficult. And it's particularly difficult because, our side is the Democratic side. And so we do have a diversity of opinion. We have debate, as you're supposed to in a democracy. So there's not this monolithic view or narrative that's coming out of Israel and coming out of the West. Whereas the bad guys, like in Gaza, you and I both know there are people who object to Hamas. But if they get to a podium and stand up and express that,
That's the end of them, right?
they will be killed. So, the other side, by virtue of being a dictatorship and vicious and violent, is actually quite disciplined in their messaging. And what's extraordinary is they've been able to preserve that kind of message discipline throughout the West as well. There's an alphabet soup of, I don't know, 150 to 200 of these anti-Semitic groups in North America at the present time. And their ability to keep together on the message piece is something else. For example, when the ceasefire took place in October of last year, their demand for a ceasefire, well, it had been met. Israel said, okay, we're going to have a ceasefire. And it just took them 6 hours to turn on a dime, this very disciplined group I'm talking about, and start focusing on IDF soldiers committing war crimes. And here they are where they live in Canada and the United States and elsewhere, and crimes within the West Bank. To be able to do that on a global basis within 6 hours, not only is that extraordinary communication skill, that's something that's never happened before. So I think a lot of us in the West need to throw off our arrogance or our indifference and thinking, oh, we're just dealing with people who are living in caves, and writing on stone tablets. We're not. We're dealing with some very sophisticated communicators who know what they're doing. And even though they hate the West, they know how to move public opinion in the West.
Where should we be making investments to better fight this war?
as we talked about, telling the story of Israel better. And so communicating that to the world. Israel is the most technologically advanced country in the world. For its size, it is amazing, the technological advancements. But because Israel has been driven by a bit of an internal debate over where it's going as a country.
That was a very polite Canadian way to say that. Slight disagreement over the internal politics. Okay.
Yeah. And we're going to see what happens in October. We're going to see, who wins or whatever. But that needs to come together. Israelis need to say, okay, and I've said this to my Jewish friends here in the West, we are facing an existential crisis, truly, meaning our existence is threatened. We need to get our act together, boys and girls, and land on a central strategy and a central message. And, I'm a campaign guy. That's what I do. And it has blown me away that we've been unable, or the Jewish community has been unable to do that at a time when its existence is literally threatened. So that's something that we need to do. And we need to tell the story of who these people are and expose them. Nothing makes cockroaches scatter better than daylight, right? You shine a light on them. That's what I try to do in the book. That's what I try to do in the documentary that I did.
Tell us about the documentary, which I love.
Basically, the documentary is the visual expression of the thesis in the book, and it's called The Campaign. And it's about disinformation at a time of war. And so all the things that you and I have talked about are in there. And we have people from Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense in the United States, to smart people like you and Elon Levy and so on. And there's parts of it that are critical of the government of Israel for kind of letting the ball drop on the communications front. But it's, we're going to try and get it out there. We have no illusions about our ability to get it on Netflix or any of that stuff, or the CBC here in Canada. That ain't going to happen. So we're going to be creative about how we can get it in front of people.
Absolutely agree that what we have been facing off against is a nefarious, well-funded, well-organized campaign that's been underway for years, and we've underestimated them. And I know that technology really needs to play a meaningful role in fighting back, but that's going to feel out of reach to a lot of people that don't have the technical skills. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how we build critical thinking. How do we make people more resilient to manipulation? Have you thought about that as well, and what democracies could be doing, or ordinary people listening right now could be doing to help encourage the building of critical thinking skills?
It's an important question, and it's got a multi-layered answer to it. And you've identified all of us have a role to play. And by all of us, I mean governments, individuals, NGOs, associations, charities. So, what I'm used to in a campaign is we have a defined campaign period, and we have a campaign manager, and he or she says, Kinsella, you're doing this. And Aviva, you're doing this. And here's the message, and here's our resources, and go to it. And that has not happened here. So, governments love, for example, advocacy advertising. They love advertising to us about healthcare and smoking and all kinds of other things. Well, they need to do some advertising about this, about the perniciousness and the dangers of anti-Semitic hate. The Jewish organizations in the West, what I've observed as your Irish Catholic buddy, is they spend an awful lot of time fighting each other and not coming together on a central strategy. And, the competitive fundraising against each other, that needs to stop. And then individual citizens need to stop considering themselves to be powerless. Like if you're out there listening to me right now and you're in Red Deer or you're in Topeka, Kansas, and you have a story to tell about what you experienced personally, or somebody you know in Israel, or some wonderful thing that happened to you, tell that story and be relentless about it on the internet. That's what I did years ago. I was a witness. I ended up not being called, but I was a witness for the amazing Deborah Lipstadt in her libel action against David Irving, the Holocaust denier. And as soon as my name was on the witness list, all of these haters started attacking me around the globe. And I wasn't sure what to do. And some friends said, start a website. They've got websites, start a website. Well, I did. So I get 6 million visitors a year, depending on the year, to my website. And it's just me, they're not coming there because I'm some genius or something. I'm just relentlessly putting content up and telling the stories that I think need to be told. Anybody can do that. You don't need a government or a corporation behind you. So to answer your important question, all of us have a role to play here because the campaign we are facing is operating at multiple levels. It's operating in a governmental level, state level support of anti-Semitic hate, but also charities and NGOs and nonprofits and associations and academia and public service unions and student organizations, all of it. Like they've penetrated all of that. And we need to have an opposing structure that is just as effective, because I believe if we do that, we will win because we have the better story. Like we're telling the truth. They're liars. We're not liars. We're telling a better story about democracy and civilization and the decency of Israel and the amazing contributions of the Jewish people to the human race. We have a better story to tell.
We have a better story, and I will add that we have better people. Chief amongst those better people that I count is you. I gave some of your bio at the beginning, but I want to sing your praises. Warren is a political strategist. He's a journalist. He's a kingmaker of Canadian politicians, but he's also an attorney. He's the author of 10 books. He's got a documentary out. You've heard it. He is one of the smartest, most intelligent, most analytical people on this topics. And I want to encourage you, if you're listening and looking to bring someone to your community, you consider bringing Warren to talk about The Hidden Hand, his book, or his documentary, The Campaign. Where can they find you in order to be able to do that?
You can get me at warrenkinsella.com, and the book, they can get it on Amazon. I guess that's the easiest way to get it. And then the documentary will be rolling out at a theater, hopefully near you, coming this fall.
You are a treasure. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.